Meantime, I'm a colleague of Ted at Lancaster, and I'm based at the Department of Linguistics and English Language. And just like Maggie, I've also been playing with the topic of my talk, and I changed it a little bit. I was planning to also include a little bit on a study of sentiment analysis of what kinds of tweets people are sharing about climate change. But because it seems like the focus of these 2 days is more around journalism, what does it do, which it does well, what can it do better, I decided instead to focus on just 2 studies which are looking at 2 types of media: constructive journalism, which is something that is very much talked about these days, and more mainstream traditional media, so newspapers like The Guardian. And if we go to slide 3, so my plan for today was to briefly share findings from 2 studies. One of them is a study of how constructive journalism reporting, and specifically the constructive journalism news magazine Positive News from the UK, has been reporting the topic of sustainability. And the other study which I wanted to share is a study of how opinion content, so editorials and op-eds, have been discussing the topic of climate change. And the reason why I picked these 2 studies is because my own feeling is that the role of journalists, whether mainstream media-based or based in constructive media, my feeling is that in both of these cases, they have done a really good job in communicating what can be done in order to move to a more sustainable society and to really address the challenges of climate change. And the kinds of approaches which I'm using in these 2 studies are really 2 methodologies that are probably most popular in media and communication studies: frame analysis, and in the other study, metaphor analysis, which is one of the most popular ways in linguistics to analyze news discourse. So if we move to slide 4, first of all, my first study about sustainability and how it is discussed in news articles from a constructive journalism magazine. So my research question here was, how is sustainability represented in this type of news? And as you can see, the data sample was very small, very boutique, and it's focused entirely on UK's Positive News magazine. The time period is 2 years, basically, since it was relaunched online as an online publication. And although you might be familiar with constructive journalism, I have decided to just say a couple of words about what it is. So constructive journalism, the way that I understand it, has precedence in other types of journalism, like peace journalism, and it has a lot of links with contextual journalism as well. But as a term in and of its own, it has become more popular in the more recent years. So on slide 5, I've put just a little bit of information on constructive journalism. I just wanted to say that, yeah, constructive journalism is something that has gained a lot of attention in the recent years. It has precedence in other types of journalism. But something interesting maybe to keep in mind is that there is a little bit of overlap in the use of the terms constructive journalism and solutions journalism. And my impression is that usually in Europe, when we talk about this kind of reporting, we use the term constructive journalism. And in the US, it seems to be solutions journalism, which is the term that is preferred. But the way that it looks to me is that whichever term you use, if we try to understand this type of journalism, one of the key things is the emphasis on talking about solutions as part of reporting stories on different events and issues. And if we look at one of the definitions of constructive journalism by Ulrich Hagerup, He says, for example, that a constructive news article contains the problem definition, but also takes us a step further by showing a possible solution. And then a more recent definition by Karen McIntyre, she says that a way of practicing constructive journalism is by focusing on solutions. So in some ways, to me at least, it looks like whichever term we use, solutions is a very key part of this new approach to reporting. And then that kind of focus on solutions is very much linked to the theoretical and methodological framework which I used in this study, which is framing and frame analysis. And I think it's safe to say that framing and frame analysis is probably the most popular and widely used way of analyzing news discourse in media and communication studies. So very briefly, framing is about making some aspects of reality more salient to promote a problem definition, causal interpretation, moral evaluation, and treatment recommendation, or in other words, a solution. And what we also know from existing research is that frames have a better chance of catching up with people and influencing how they see issues if they are resonant with some widely shared cultural values, beliefs, narratives, and so on. So if we move on to slide 7, I will actually skip that slide because here I'm just talking a little bit more about methodologically how I carried out the analysis. And I will go straight to slide number 8, where you should be able to see a table with the kinds of frames which I discovered in news articles from Positive News and how they talk about the topic of sustainability. And the most interesting thing about this study is that when I started reading about how sustainability is being covered in more traditional media, so newspapers like the New York Times, like the Guardian, previous research shows that usually this kind of media doesn't talk about sustainability a lot. And also when it reports about sustainability, when journalists talk about solutions, they present solutions in very pessimistic ways. So the idea is that that is a possible solution, but it will never work because it's very expensive. And another finding was that when sustainability is talked about in more mainstream media, there's usually 2 frames which dominate the coverage. These are belief in the power of the market and belief in the power of science. So in the light of these findings from more traditional media, what was different in my study of this constructive journalism news magazine was that, as we can expect, there was a lot more focus on solutions. So every news article was talking about problems, but it was very much focused on solutions as well. And solutions were reported in very optimistic and positive ways. What I found is that you still encounter frames like belief in the power of the market and belief in the power of science, which you also find in pretty much the same shape in more mainstream or traditional media reporting. But also you have a very different way of seeing sustainability, which I've not encountered in previous studies. And I have called this the value of camaraderie. But first of all, I will just say a couple of words about the other 2 frames, belief in the power of the market and belief in the power of science. So they are also found in more traditional mainstream media, and they have received quite a bit of criticism from eco-linguistics, but also researchers on environmental change and climate change. And the main problem with these 2 frames is that they don't really ask people to make significant changes to the way in which they live, and they don't question the organization of our society. And basically the kinds of changes which they're asking us to make are so minimal that according to scientists, they will not be enough to move to a sustainable society and to overcome climate change. So according to the belief in the power of the market frame, the main problem, the way it is defined or suggested in these news articles is that the main problem is mainstream businesses which engage in unethical sourcing practices. They are wasteful, and the solution is that we keep spending, keep buying products, so no change in that, but we just change the way in which we spend and we increase our demand for sustainable products. So very minimal changes. The other frame, belief in the power of science, which has received criticism as well for asking for very minimal changes, sees sustainability and climate change as extremely complex problems, but the solution basically doesn't ask citizens to do anything because ultimately science and technology are going to solve all the problems. And against this, what was different in this Constructive Journalism news magazine was that there were many articles which were elaborating a frame which I've called the value of camaraderie, which has not been reported before. And what is interesting on sustainability is that it really does challenge the way in which society works at the moment. And it is trying to present a very attractive and positive and appealing way of responding to the challenge of becoming sustainable. The problem here, the way that it's defined in these news articles, is that it's not about mainstream business. It's about people, it's about all of us, and being obsessed with buying new products, consuming and purchasing stuff. And the solution is that we actually have to try to buy less and instead focus on community building, on sharing, on fixing things together. The articles were talking a lot about repair cafes where people can come together and they can become part of something bigger, like a community, and feel connected. So I will skip the quotes and details on slide 9, and I will go straight to slide 10, where I wanted to try to evaluate the implications of this new frame, the value of camaraderie in constructive journalism reporting. And at least my personal evaluation is that it's a very positive development because there is indeed some evidence that we probably have to consume less in order to become more sustainable, but that is a very unpleasant message to give to people. So you really need to have an appealing way of making that proposition. And from what I could see in those articles, by drawing on this value of community building, of camaraderie, constructive journalism offers some opportunities to move society to a more sustainable future by really offering an attractive, culturally resonant story or frame that we can adopt. So that was the first study, and I will move on to slide 11 and the second study, which is not about constructive journalism anymore. It focuses on very traditional mainstream media, but it's not looking at news articles. The focus is on opinion content, so editorials and op-eds about climate change. My main research questions here were: what are the most frequently used metaphors when discussing climate change, and what functions do metaphors perform? And I will say a couple of more words about metaphors and their functions. So hopefully it will become a little bit clearer. The data set is a little bit larger, so it's editorials and op-eds. And what I should also say about this study is that it's country comparative. So the analysis is based on one newspaper from Germany, the UK, and the US. And if you look at the newspapers, you will see that all of them are very much pro-climate change. So the kinds of metaphors that we are going to look at are metaphors which are very much employed in arguments to do something to stop climate change. So they're not skeptical newspapers. Now on slide 12, I just wanted to say a few more words about what are metaphors and why is it important to analyze them. So actually, metaphor analysis is one of the most popular ways of analyzing news discourse in linguistics. And very basically, metaphors are interesting to study because they are very dominant and very prevalent in text and talk. According to some research, we use about 6 metaphors per minute. But we also know that they are especially useful and common when people try to talk and think about issues which are complex, which are new, which are vague. So climate change is no longer a new issue, but it's still complex and vague, and we can expect that discussions of these types of issues will be very rich in metaphors. So metaphors are ways of talking about one thing in terms of another, and potentially also thinking of one thing in terms of another. So at the very basic level, one of the functions that metaphors can perform is to conceptualize issues. So one of the functions is conceptualization by metaphor. But also, we know that metaphors are extremely common in persuasive writing. So things like political speeches, like political campaigns, press releases, which is why we also talk about another function of metaphors at the very basic level, and that is the argumentative function. So try to support or discredit an argument by using different kinds of metaphors. And then on slide 13, I just wanted to give a few very brief examples about clarifying this role of conceptualization by metaphor and argumentation by metaphor. And I haven't used examples from climate change or the coronavirus crisis, but I have examples from an issue that has been very much talked about in the UK, and that's Brexit. So we can see this function of metaphors to help us conceptualize issues which are vague and complex. With the example from The Economist, where we have the title, The Road to Brexit. So in the textual part of this article, we have a reference to a road, so a journey metaphor. There is no literal road which leads to Brexit. But then also in the visual aspect of the article, we see the car with British registration and Boris Johnson and Theresa May, who are presumably driving away from the EU. So in this way, this journey metaphor, which is communicated in the text and the image, is simply helping us to conceptualize or to think about what Brexit is going to look like. But we can also see examples of argumentation by metaphor in the other example, where we see the language of journey being employed to argue in favor of a very specific argument. In this case, I have a quote from a government official who says that a managed no-deal Brexit will provide a smooth glide path to leaving the EU without an agreement. So, in other words, the journey metaphor is part of a very specific argument of how we should leave the EU. So that was just for a little bit more background. I will also skip slide 14, which talks about the method and methodological procedure of analyzing these op-eds and editorials in order to find metaphors. And I will go straight to slide 15, which summarizes the results. So what we found in this study was that there were a lot of metaphors which were being used, and in all cases, they were used to support action on climate change, which again is unsurprising because of the types of newspapers that we analyzed, which are very much pro-climate change. But what was interesting was that in these arguments that we have to act on climate change, they were drawing on very different domains of metaphors. So in the German newspaper, in Süddeutsche Zeitung, that was the metaphor of illness. In The Guardian, this was the metaphor of war. And in the New York Times, the metaphor of journey. And we felt that this was, again, probably quite positive and interesting, because if we link these findings to studies about culture and history of these countries, it looks like editors are drawing on metaphors that are supposedly, again, very much culturally resonant with the people that they are addressing. So we wanted to argue that by using metaphors of illness to talk about how we need to act on climate change, op-eds and editorials are supposedly really doing a good job, because this idea of illness is very much connected to acid rain and the effect on forest decline in Germany, which was one of the issues that led to the founding of the Green Party in Germany. And we know, and there's been much written about the role of the forest in German culture and history from Nazi era movies and year before. Then with war, we also felt like that this is a very positive approach, because again, journalists, if they are drawing on a kind of experience which British national identity, there are some very interesting studies which analyze metaphor use on different kinds of topics, and they compare different Anglophone countries. And what is interesting is that compared to the US, Australia, Canada, the UK always comes on top as using war metaphors on almost any issue, a lot more than other English-speaking countries. So there has been something written about the role of war and how much this kind of language is resonant. And finally, in terms of using journey metaphors and journey language in New York Times op-eds and editorials to talk about how important it is to do something about climate change, we also felt that this is very positive development, because we have come across studies which tell us that this idea of a journey should be very much resonant with people in the United States, because of the whole way in which the country is sometimes depicted in art as a voyaging ship. But also there are many studies in linguistics which show us that Barack Obama, for example, he was using a lot of journey metaphors in his campaigns, but also in office. And there is a lot of speculation that this was done on purpose, because of being aware how much this journey language and journey metaphors are resonant with the US population. So on slide 16, I think I will just read out, hopefully there is time, I will just read out one example just to show how illness metaphors in Süddeutsche Zeitung were used in arguments to encourage action on climate change, by emphasizing how irrational it will be if we don't act. I will just quickly read this example too. So from this editorial, the metaphorical language is highlighted in red, and we see the example, the patient is dangerously ill, but to him the therapy seems, although he is not lacking in resources, too expensive. He has anxiously consulted the best specialists. They have all arrived at the same diagnosis, and yet the patient only takes the medicine sporadically, sometimes not at all. But which patient is so stupid? It's the whole world. So the whole idea here is that by using this kind of culturally resonant language of illness metaphors, op-eds and editorials were very often trying to emphasize that we need to act on climate change. So having said that, I will skip straight to slide number 19, where again, I have tried to think a little bit about the implications of this kind of reporting. And my at least assessment is that that's another very positive example of what journalists, editors are doing in order to motivate action on climate change. Because
I'm on the correct slide, right? Slide 17.
19. Sorry,
oh, 19.
19. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No.
So there's slide 18. I'm sorry. I'm just leaving it up there so people can see it in the
Okay.
video. And then slide 19. Please go ahead.
Slide 19 is just to say that that is a quite positive practice from what I would say, because all of these newspapers are obviously saying that we have to act on climate change, but what is really important is that they are drawing on culturally resonant metaphors in order to do that, and that should be a very powerful way of delivering the message. That really is everything which I wanted to say. I still don't see anything on my computer or laptop screen, but I suppose what I wanted to finish with is that we often talk about probably a lot of the analysis in linguistics, which draws on critical discourse analysis and analyzes media and how it reports on different kinds of issues. It usually identifies a lot of problems, a lot of ways in which the reporting can be done in better ways. But what I thought is quite interesting and promising about these two studies is that as far as I could see, or as far as we could see, was that journalists and editors are doing a really good and useful job in talking about sustainability and climate change by drawing on very powerful, culturally resonant themes. So I suppose that's where I'm going to stop. And yeah, that's where I'm going to stop. Thank you.